Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Documentary Club, a place for documentary lovers. I'm Jeff Jones, and with me, as always, is Jack. Like and subscribe if you enjoy our discussions. You can join the channel to help support us and get perks such as advanced notifications on which documentaries we will cover next and new clips before they go public. Today, we are talking about The 13th, a documentary released on October 7th, 2016 on Netflix. A lot to be said about this one, but before we get to it, I'd like to welcome in Jack properly. How are you doing today, Jack?
Doing very well. Thank you so much. And to everyone out there in the ether, as we say, listening in. This is a great documentary. It's a really kind of a difficult one to watch if you're honest, but should be a good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this one dovetails pretty well with last week's documentary when we talked about power. And in fact, some of the same footage is used in this documentary as it was in Power. So that tells you how closely related they can be. The 13th is about the 13th Amendment and issues related to what happened after slavery was abolished in this country and what those effects were to the populace overall, and more specifically in Black folks, African American folks who were released from slavery, and how that affected society, how it affected their lives. And so this is a really interesting documentary. Like you said, Jack, it's a tough watch. As they say, the truth can be difficult. And if you're not familiar with what happened in our nation after slavery and Jim Crow and how policies were developed after slavery, then this is something that I think everybody should check out if you're not familiar with it.
Totally agree. The 13th Amendment. I mean, it's not in in the first 10 being the Bill of Rights, but there are 26 amendments, I think, to our Constitution. So it's constitutional law. But people should really read the 13th Amendment themselves and not, necessarily take a documentary's word for it or our word for it. Read what it says. And the words are important and they have to be followed. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, except if you get convicted of a felony. So that's a big thing. That's a huge thing if you ponder it right down to its core meaning.
Saying that the state or the country has no right to enslave anyone unless you've been convicted of a crime, in which case we can take your freedom. But what does that mean entirely? It's easy to go back and say, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. Hindsight is 2020. It's a powerful documentary. There are included interviews with folks from both sides of the political aisle, so it is not necessarily slanted one way or the other. It's just an honest, I think, approach to the repercussions, what happened after slavery. This documentary is also available on YouTube, which is not always the case with Netflix documentaries, but this one is available on YouTube for those of you that don't have a Netflix account. So there's really no excuse not to check this one out. Let's get to our first clip, Jack. What do you want to take a look at first?
Well, I think you really should start with the opening stats because these statistics of prison population are scattered throughout the entire documentary. I think it's important to capture as we go along, and some of these changes that were made, to our government policies and laws and so forth.
The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners.
1 out of 4 human beings with their hands on bars are locked up here in the land of the free.
300,000 in 1972. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
Gotten too expensive. It's gotten out of hand.
We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. If we are Black, we are products of the history that our ancestors most likely did not choose. And we have to understand that in order to escape. 13th Amendment to the Constitution grants freedom to all Americans.
There's a clause, a loophole.
And I think that's really an important part that we can't let breeze past us. People who wanted to use this in a nefarious method figured out, oh, we can enslave people if they've committed a crime. All we have to do is convict them of a crime.
That's right.
And me and my buddies, we're the sheriff in this town. We decide what's a crime. And that is one of the mass incarceration problems that happened after the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865.
You know, this term mass incarceration, and it didn't really have a place in our history until that time frame. Better way to put it, I guess. But it did happen, and it just got worse. You know, look at us today. It's a massive business. There's a huge amount of billions of dollars per year. And it's not just one company, it's several that've got their hands in this big piece of pie.
When you privatize prisons and you're essentially privatizing part of the justice system, there is a desire for shareholders to want more people to be in prison, not because they did something wrong, but because it helps our bottom line. And that's wrong. We have to have checks and balances on that. We can't just have, well, we want to make more money, and the way to make more money is to lock more people up, because then the government is going to pay us, a private organization, to keep these people locked up. And, you know, I'm not always a big fan of the slippery slope argument, but we've been sliding down this slide for quite some time, and it's not slowing down. It seems like it's speeding up.
You know, you think about the original, I guess, call them landowners that were looking for cheap labor that originally went and grabbed these slaves from, West Africa, brought them over, not even thinking that aspect of it. Here we are, hundreds of years later, and the problem is just magnified. How do you deprogram and unplug everything that's happened since that time frame and all the actions that have occurred? You know, I'm from an older generation than even you, but even when I was young, some of the stuff was still talked about. I mean, I'm from the South, so it was still talked about. I mean, not necessarily in a negative way, but there were still conversations about, slavery and some of the things around it. Of course, I was too young to really understand it, but I do remember it.
I think that's a really great segue into our next clip, talking about deprogramming and programming people's perceptions. And that is to talk about really an important and monumental film that was released, and that's called The Birth of a Nation. And if people aren't familiar with The Birth of a Nation, I highly recommend digging into it. I don't know if you have to watch the whole thing. You could definitely check out reviews and literature that has been written about it, but it basically portrayed former slaves or African Americans as less than, and as criminals, and as rapists, and as the people who would essentially ruin the nation, not build it up. Talking about programming, Birth of a Nation film was part of that programming.
And it was released. Remember this, guys. This was released in 1915.
Let's watch a little portion of that.
And when it was released, it had this rapturous response.
And every image you see of a black person is a demeaned animal-like image.
A woman throws herself off a cliff rather than be raped by a black male.
The white political elite and the business establishment needed black bodies working.
Birth of a Nation was almost directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan never had the ritual of burning the cross, so it was literally an instance of life imitating art.
We had lynchings in this country between Reconstruction and World War II on the idea that they had done something criminal. Demographic geography of this country was shaped by that era. They went there as refugees from terror.
I think it's such an important point that he made there to talk about escaping the terrorism.
That's right. I mean, there were towns south of where I grew up in Tennessee that black people would not go to that town at all because they knew they would be killed or seriously hurt. They would not enter that town. And this was when I was a child. You know, we're talking about the 60s. It was that bad. It's terrible.
That's right. I feel, sorry that was ever part of our nation, but it's a hard truth that we have to, look dead center in the eyes of and deal with and understand.
If that was fixed, how many other problems they just go away? They are eliminated in our society.
Then it shifted to something more legal, segregation.
Really begin to live out the prophecy that Griffith was making about the way that race operates.
Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
Civil rights activists began to be portrayed as criminals.
Justice too long delayed is justice denied.
Really powerful words there. Justice delayed is justice denied. And it's a term, a saying that we've been using ever since. You said before that clip that there were people, black folks, that wouldn't go to towns that you knew of. And the footage in this documentary pretty much backs up exactly. If you want to be treated, if you want to be kicked, if you want to be assaulted openly in the streets, if you don't want to do that, don't come to our town.
That's right.
Because no one is going to arrest us for doing that, for assaulting you.
That's right.
And the Birth of a Nation film, if you cannot talk about this without that film. You cannot talk about the portrayal of African Americans in this country without talking about that, because all of those ideals stem back from that film.
They do. They were integrated into the next generation, and it carried forward. And again, it changed. As they talked about, okay, they approached this from a different way. This Birth of a Nation was part of that, and that carried forward. So we covered segregation. The civil rights activists in the 60s were basically labeled as criminal. Some of them were treated really badly. Then we get into the Civil Rights and the Voting Acts, the 1970 prison population. This is the Nixon era where we really start getting into this war on crime, war on drugs, which is just a fantastical flop of a failure. Probably trillions of dollars at this point have been poured into these programs that don't work.
But you give the opportunity to discriminate, and I think that's the problem, is that a lot of laws, even laws that are meant to, with the good intention, when used improperly, can be used to discriminate. And I mean, it's not hard to imagine that if you watch old movies that deal with these topics, you'll have the sheriff and he'll say, yeah, well, the law gives me the power to arrest you. I didn't do anything. That's not what I saw. I saw you assault that woman.
Yep. You're going to jail.
Now you're going to jail. And now you can't compete for another job. And that was a big part of it as well, is that the economics of it cannot be downplayed enough, because there was a threat that a former slave could now compete for you in your job. And that was a real fear that was struck into the hearts of white America. And I believe that was part of it, that if we lock them up, they can't compete for jobs.
That's right. It's another means of control.
This can be such a moment.
It's with the Nixon era when crime begins to stand in for race.
Part of what he talked about was a war on crime, one of those code words, which really was referring to the black political movements of the day.
That they eventually are going to be apprehended. Federal spending for local law enforcement will double. The wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in the United States of America.
Yes, eat those words, Nixon. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't think it worked. And, to sum up what I saw, now this is just my opinion, was we need to have a war on crime. Wink, wink. Not you guys that are white and go to church every Sunday and follow the law, but for those other people. Wink, wink.
Right. It's disgusting. It really is. And you get this, a new president steps in. The war on crime is and it's just a repeat. They wash the words a little bit, but it's the same speech.
It is. It's the same speech. I think we talked about that last week in the documentary Power, where the war on drugs was another. I've heard this said many times. The war on drugs is a war on people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The drugs don't feel the pain. The drugs, and I made the point last week as well that all the money that's been spent on the war on drugs, if we had spent that on the war on addiction, we'd be in a better position today.
The modern war on drugs was declared by Ronald Reagan in 1982.
The war against drugs is a war of individual battles.
This is your brain on drugs.
I have to stop it because of the brain on the drugs thing. I just need to add a little bit that clip of this is your brain on drugs. This is not the original one that was played on TV. It is like singed into my brain of that commercial. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? I don't know about your generation, but my generation found this to be a parody, a comical. We thought it was a joke. We laughed about it. It was never taken seriously. And it's these poor analogies, this trying to make an association with this egg and a fried egg where we're going, hey man, I know people who've taken drugs and they still speak fine. You know, their brains literally didn't fry in a pan. This is ridiculous. And basically this attempt at propaganda was a complete and total failure. And it's almost a perfect representation of the war on drugs. This commercial, this is your brain on drugs, using an egg, a fried egg, which is just completely absurd. It meant nothing. It did nothing. And people thought it was great. Some people thought it was great.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it, and we all kind of like chuckled about it. I mean, I was older when I remember first seeing this back in the early 80s, but growing up, in the teenage years in the 70s, yeah, sure, I knew some people that smoked weed, and I really didn't know hardly any people that did much more than that, really, to be honest. A few. My brother was one of them, unfortunately, but he got mixed into a group of guys that, it was always taking it to that next level. And was it gateway? A gateway kind of thing? I don't know. If he had been by himself and kind of left alone, would he have ever went further than maybe just having some weed, drinking some liquor? I doubt it. It really was that kind of a parody thing, but we weren't as intelligent at the time about a lot of things that were really going on in the background that most Americans never heard about. There was huge amounts of money that were poured in. Again, this war on drugs really started in the 70s with Nixon, because he did coin that term, but it wasn't nearly what Reagan did in the 80s. Oh my God.
All right, we're going to play the next clip. Crack cocaine. Crack cocaine changed a lot. I mean, it changed the 80s. It almost defined the 80s in the criminal world, to say the least.
Well, it also, we start thinking about, and I think we're going to talk about it here, the sentencing differences between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. It was a big problem.
Absolutely. Another racial disparity.
Called crack. It's dangerous. It's deadly. It will kill you.
Crack was largely an inner city issue, and cocaine was largely a suburban issue.
Mandatory sentencing penalties for crack that were far harsher than those for powder cocaine.
And if you're white, you're pretty much getting a slap on the wrist.
A scythe went through our black communities, literally huge chunks just disappearing into our prisons.
I think that's a really important point that he made right there about the scythe cutting through the black communities and just decimating and leaving a lot of, families without a father figure. And yep. I'm not saying that what they did was right and that they should get a pass for it. But when you see that the criminal penalty for powder cocaine is 100 times less than crack cocaine.
Yeah, you got a problem.
You got a problem. And again, we go back and we say, well, the intention, was to stop crack cocaine. It wasn't intended to just lock up black men, but the unintended consequences have to be studied as well. A Wall Street guy gets busted with powder cocaine, he gets a slap on the wrist. And if a black urban man gets arrested with crack, he goes to prison for the rest of his life.
He's got a couple of rocks and he gets freaking hammered. Yeah.
That's
right.
unintended consequences. And that's why we always have to be careful with every law that we pass or every law that's initiated, that what are the unintended consequences? What are the outcomes? And I keep saying that word. I think you're going to have to call me Outcome Jeff pretty soon, because Outcomes are the important point that we're looking at. What was the outcome of this war on crack? What actually happened?
Well, and this is another great segue as to what happened, and we have to speak of it quite a bit on the political landscape, because the Democrats saw these successes the Republicans were having with a lot of people throughout the country about this harshness on crime, and what happened in the 90s when, after Reagan, comes Bush, and then Bill Clinton says, aha, we need
That's the way.
more. Yeah, this is the way we do it.
This is
So
how I
he's trying to,
win. I have
yeah,
to
this
be
is
tough on crime.
right. He's trying to balance, the civil rights side being a Democrat with the Republican side. They're one of these harsh kind of things within the criminal justice system. Along comes this crime bill in the 90s, but we'll get into that. But if you really want to look at criminal justice when it changed, it was the 80s and 90s. It really set the tone. And if you want to talk about the swinging of the pendulum, if you're looking at the scales of justice, it really got unbalanced, and it still is to this very day.
This next clip, we're going to talk about Reagan's strategist caught on tape explaining the Southern strategy.
Lee Atwater was caught on tape explaining the Southern strategy.
By 1968, you can't say nigga, that hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than white.
Boom.
Boom. Exactly.
Blacks get hurt worse than whites.
Yep.
And if that isn't the analogy for how the justice system can be abused, I don't know what is.
And they knew it. They were well
and they
aware
knew
of
it,
what
and
they
that
were
was
doing.
their strategy.
That's right.
Yeah, a few white people will get locked up too, but more black people will get locked up. More black people will get hurt by this. So that's a good thing. And we
Yes.
can't use racial slurs anymore. So we'll call it states' rights, or we'll call it forced busing. We'll use the dog whistle of the time, because we can't use the actual slur anymore.
That's right. Exactly right.
It's like proponents of this would say these things are true, and then the other side would say that's not true. That was not a dog whistle. Forced busing was not a dog whistle for race. Here you have the guy saying it right on recording. He's explaining it clearly. I had never heard this recording before. I'm surprised I hadn't. You had. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
It's
think
81, but they're continuing to build prisons. These sentences are getting stiffer. More people are getting arrested, feeding into the system, the prison system. And they coined up this term, super predator. It gets mentioned as well. The super predator. That was a big buzzword. All the politicians were using it for, their effect.
Right, both sides of the aisle. Hillary Clinton is in this documentary saying it.
That's
You have
right.
Republicans, Newt Gingrich saying it, right? So it wasn't one side, or it wasn't just
No.
Republicans saying it. It was coined and it was used. But if we go back to this recording that we just listened to, we can't say the slur anymore. So we'll come up with a new term.
That's right. Exactly right. And this was one of them.
And we look at these prison stats right here. 1980, you had 500,000. 5 years later, you've almost doubled.
Yeah, here you are, 200 and whatever thousand, 260,000 more, whatever the hell the number is.
I mean, look at that. Almost 1.2 million people in 1990 were locked up. An increase
300
of almost
plus,
3 times since 1980, right?
300 plus thousand more in 5 years.
Right. And in 1980, the stat we just showed was right around 400,000. So if you multiply times 3, you're pretty much there. In 10 years, you've tripled prison population. In 10
Crazy.
years.
Yep. And it gets worse. Yeah, we get into mandatory minimums, and this is legislation that gets passed, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, where judges were no longer allowed to make a decision on what someone would get prison sentence wise. That decision was taken out of their hands. for the most part, we had good judges that made good decisions based on the circumstances of that case. But then, of course, we had the corrupt judges that were, they were willing to take a payoff to, look the other way, give a really bad guy pretty much a slap on the wrist. The mandatory minimums happened, and some of them were really harsh. We get into 3 strikes. Remember the 3 strikes that got passed in California, then it got adopted nationally.
See, you have the mandatory minimum sentences for drugs. And in my eyes, it should be mandatory drug rehabilitation. It should be a mandatory rehab, right? If you had taken the same amount of money that it costs to house an inmate for all those years and you put it towards their rehab, I've said this before, but we'd be in a better position. Society would be in a better position. There would be less addiction. There would be less drug use. The bigger picture is, why is this happening? Why are there mandatory sentences? Because every time a politician says, I'm tough on crime, I passed more bills that are tougher on crime, then the next guy comes and says, I'm tougher on crime. And then the next person says, I'm tougher on crime. And the sentences keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty much you've backed yourself into a corner where every infraction is a huge sentence.
That's
and there's
right.
no room for correction. There's no room for rehabilitation.
No.
I laugh when they call it the correctional institution. Correcting what? What are you correcting? Other than
nothing.
Other than stock owners' prices that you're correcting. There is no correction in corrections and rehabilitation. When it should be. It could be.
And now we're backed into this, as you said, backed into this corner, and they're not fixing the problem. They know there's a problem. This money trail, it's so powerful now. There's so much money being dumped into the prison system. It's a massive conglomerate.
Mandatory sentencing. We said we were no longer going to let judges consider the circumstances around a crime.
We've taken discretion away from judges, arguably the most neutral party in the court, and given it over to prosecutors.
We passed a truth in sentencing law that kept people in prison for 85% of their sentence.
The public wants to be confident that you're going to do just about every bit of that time.
When you remove the parole system, when you have truth in sentences, these things sound good. It sounds truth in sentencing. That's what you got. You were put up for 30 years. You're serving 28. It sounds good on paper, but we're removing any potential for rehabilitation. We're removing that idea that someone can do good and turn their life around.
Well, that aspect has now been fully kind of recognized, because now that once you went to prison, you get out, you're screwed. You're completely screwed. There's no attempt at, as you said, rehab. Now there are a few that are able to, get an education while they're within the system. I really don't know how difficult these things are. I don't. Some people get a law degree, or whatever. So they're ready to kind of hit the ground running when they come out. But again, been pushed through law and order and all these other societal things that have been popularized, that once you've been in prison and you're labeled a felon, even if it's a white collar crime, not a violent crime, even if it's a white collar crime, you're a felon. You get stigmatized. You go to a job application. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? You go to get an apartment. Have you ever been convicted of a felony, right? These things follow you. So you've paid your price to society according to the law.
But you got that scarlet letter.
That's right. You can't get rid of it.
You can't get rid of it.
Ever.
Right. The next clip is about the federal crime bill and the militarization of the police, which ties in very, very closely to what we talked about last week in the documentary Power.
Federal crime bill of 1994 that was heavily loaded towards law enforcement incarceration.
To deploy the latest technologies and tactics to make our communities even safer.
It provided all kinds of money and perverse incentives for law enforcement.
It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street.
But also to put 100,000 police officers on the street.
We actually built that infrastructure that we see today, the militarization, all the way down to small rural police departments.
Exploding prison population
and is overwhelmingly biased towards people of color.
In 1980, we had 400,000 prison population, and in 2000, in 20 years, in that 20-year time period, you've multiplied it by 5.
That's right.
The population in 20 years. That's a staggering increase.
Doesn't take a rocket scientist to not figure out that. Why? It's money, it's cash. Somebody's profiting from this, and they're profiting in a big way.
And voters are convinced that this is the right thing because we're being tough on crime, and tough on crime is good. And the tougher you get on crime, the better. When it's not always the case, right? And I think one of the stats said, these people were getting locked up for drug offenses. And again, my opinion on it. If you get caught with drugs, you should go to rehab, not to prison. Prison isn't going to do anything for your drug addiction. If you fail rehab 4 times or you break out and you commit more crimes, then yeah. But just the simple drug offense?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
We're not doing ourselves any favors. We're not. We're wasting money.
Because it's not working.
It's not working. Nobody has ever gotten off drugs because they were like, oh my God, I went to prison and I got off drugs. I couldn't get drugs in prison.
Sure.
There is a point in this documentary where Bill Clinton does say that it was the wrong thing. He has since said it was a mistake.
Well, yeah, this was actually not that long ago. I want to say 2017, but it might have been from 2019. But yeah, he did say it.
He said it was a mistake, one of the biggest mistakes of his presidency. And it's easy to double down and say, no, I was right. It's hard to admit when you're wrong. And so I appreciate that he does say that.
But it's not enough. They need to correct
Not
it.
enough.
Saying you're wrong is one thing. That's great. Takes a lot of guts. Takes even more guts to go correct it.
Go and
Fix the
correct
problem. That's right.
We were not brought here to be made citizens.
Malcolm's whole entourage was infiltrated with police.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover today asserted that the Black Panthers represent the greatest internal threat to the nation.
That is the stupidest. But they were a tiny group. I mean, if you look at it from a number standpoint, and they're the greatest threat to American democracy that there ever was. Seriously?
Well, and when you put that out there, when you have America's top cop saying that, perceptions go a long way, just like we go all the way back to Birth of a Nation. The media that people consume shapes their interpretations and perceptions. And when you have the top cop saying this, whether it's true or not, it becomes true. It becomes truth to them. We live in an era where people are like, don't be so politically correct. No, I think we do need to be politically correct in our speech. We need to be careful of the words that we say. We need to understand that leaders, when you speak, those words reverberate, and words do matter.
They do matter. That's right.
Okay, so we want to talk about Alec. I know you couldn't wait to talk more about Alec. So let's watch this clip that talks about Alec.
And all the fingers kept pointing back to Alec.
Alec is a political lobbying group. They write laws, give them to Republicans. Stand your ground, it's written by Alec.
Its members are politicians and corporations. Should politicians and corporations be in the same private club?
I know the answer. Do you know the answer?
I know the answer. Absolutely.
The answer is no. No, they should not. I mean, we could watch more about Alec, but basically they described it pretty clearly that you have these lobbying groups that are formed with politicians and corporations. Well, which corporations? Corporations part of prison?
Huge corporations. Oh, yeah.
And is it their benefit to lock up more people?
Of course it is. Keeps that cash register flowing.
I don't know if you have any more that you want to add to that, or we could watch another clip.
I mean, the only thing that I'll add, it was really eye-opening of all of the corporations that once belonged to them. I mean, I'm talking about Bayer. You could just probably think of any major company, McDonald's. Just the list was crazy. You can go to Google if you want to check more into Alec. Go to Google, type in ALEC, Boom. You can go right to their homepage.
Maybe we can skip forward a little bit to the prison and labor and the multi-billion-dollar industry.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's another.
Prison labor. Partnerships between correctional industries and private business.
You know, we beat our fists at people overseas for exploiting poor free labor, but we don't look that it's happening right here at home every day.
Microsoft, Boeing, federal inmates are making the guidance systems for the Patriot missile system. Anderson Flooring, wood products are made in Georgia. They're planted, grown, harvested, packed, and shipped by inmates.
Corporations are operating in prisons and profiting from punishment.
The public's got to stand up and take it back. It'll never get done if they don't.
Remember the 13th Amendment, what we're talking about. And what does it say? Exactly. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're using them as slave labor. I don't care how you label it. Oh, they're just working for a big corporation. Yeah, it's basically free labor. If they're
Or
getting
15
paid,
cents an hour.
If that, if
something
they're lucky.
like that, right?
Trial. Everybody insisted on a trial, the whole system would shut down.
You can make a deal and we'll give you 3 years, or you can go to trial and we'll get you 30.
Nobody in the hood goes to trial.
97% of those people who were locked up have plea bargained.
Definitely want to show the 120 Club because this goes back to the birth of the nation.
All right, let's check that out. Trump rally clip.
Knock the crap out of him, would you? Get him out of here. To punch him in the face, I'll tell you. They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks.
Knock the hell out of that big mouth. The next time we see him, we might have to kill him.
And, you know, that kind of sums up a lot of the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yep. That's right. That's exactly right.
And I think that the documentary really cut together some interesting juxtaposition or similarities from what you've seen back in the good old days. As he said, back in the good old days, we could get away with this. Back in the good old days, they'd leave him on a stretcher.
Yeah, or hang him. They'd snatch him up, grab a rope, take him out to a tree, and hang them. Seriously.
This is what we used to do to them.
Yep.
Just the language, just, you know, the words.
And
really upsetting.
That clip there is from, you know, probably 6-7 years ago. So this is now.
Right. That's right. That's right. And then one guy, he said, well, next time we might have to just kill him.
Right. Said it openly. Didn't care. They get so angry at them. You gotta die. What? That can never be our political landscape. Our country was created out of compromise. Period. People that, even though language might get heated, it wasn't about, you know, killing the other side. And this is where we are.
Yeah. And I know that we have that history and even recent history, but it can't be the thing that defines us. It just can't be.
No.
We have to be better than that. Anyway, let's move on to the more prison stats. Here we have 1 in 17 likelihood white men being incarcerated. So let's see what the stats say.
That 1 in 3 young black males is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime, which is an unbelievably shocking statistic.
And I'll just leave that frame up there for a second for us to just kind of soak in. 1 out of 3. Can you imagine that? You and your two best friends. You and your two best friends growing up in high school. One of them's going to prison.
Yep. That's right.
And I think in some areas, probably all of you.
It's very possible, depending on who's running the show.
All right, I'll let you pick the next clip for us to take a look at.
How do you get people to pay attention? This goes back to the 60s and some of the really horrific things that happened during the civil rights time. And this one black guy that got beat to death, and the family agreed to release these photos and have an open casket so people could see what happened to this guy. A lot of people said, "Oh, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to look at that," but they wanted them to look to see what was actually done to this guy.
Kind of reminds me of the Jackie Kennedy. Do you want to change your clothes, Jackie? She said, "No, I want them to see what they've done."
That's right.
Okay with it. It wasn't until things were made visual in the civil rights movement that we really saw folks come out and being shocked into movement.
But there's a kind of historical trajectory that we can trace here. Where people were writing autobiographies of slave narratives. Later in the 19th century, when people began to use photographs and they showed images, his back, and you can see just this kind of lattice of scar tissue, or the images of lynchings, which white people produced.
The murder of Emmett Till was really thought of as being one of the primary catalysts for the civil rights movement. The willingness of his mother to have an open casket funeral and see this young boy who had been killed by white supremacists in the South, to publish those photographs so that the whole Black world could see what had happened.
Look, this is what segregation looks like. These are dogs attacking children. These are people being fire hosed.
Now, when somebody can hold up one of these, get what's going on, they can put it on YouTube, and the whole world has to deal with it.
They generally would excuse it by calling us criminals. When they got to Eric Gardner,
the sentences before that were, "Why are you always stopping me? Why is it day in and day out?"
Tamir Rice at 12 years old, and the way that he was killed, you know, it hits my heart.
We got pulled over for a busted tail light in the back.
It's reflection of a much larger, brutal system of racial and social control known as mass incarceration.
I agree.
And you know, you hear people today that will call the Black Lives Matter organization movement as a terrorist organization.
Yes.
And what does that sound exactly like what we saw in this documentary? Hoover calling MLK a terrorist.
What's the dog whistle?
Movement terrorism.
The dog whistle.
Same. More things change, the more they stay the same.
That's right.
Unfortunately. They really saved some of the most shocking imagery for the end of this documentary. Very emotional.
Yes.
Hard to watch. Very hard to watch. But important. And, you know, and we just saw someone, one of the guys in the documentary say, it's going to take shocking imagery to shock people into it, to wake them up. And that's what this documentary did.
Yeah,
or does.
Absolutely. If you pay attention, if you really pay attention to what they're talking about, and you know, a lot of documentarians, I think, you know, they try to twist things, but I don't see that in this one. They just laid it out from what they found, based on what's in the 13th Amendment, and it's true. It absolutely is true.
I think we covered this one pretty thoroughly. Good conversation. I learned a lot. I hope people at home learned a lot. And I hope I urge you to go and see this documentary in its full length. You know, we try to do our best that we can to present the highlights. But this is definitely one that is shocking and should be seen as shocking, but it's also an eye-opener, especially maybe you don't understand, or you weren't really quite sure about post the 13th Amendment and what that did. But I think that the message that the documentary says is that, again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that even though we have the 13th Amendment, it doesn't mean freedom.
Absolutely not. It's another means of control. That's all it is. And, you know, when this documentary first came out, I didn't watch it. I remember seeing some ad on Netflix, and I thought I don't need to watch that. You know, I just never. And then somebody said, "You really need to watch that. You know, you're kind of into the legal criminal justice thing. I'm like, really? And I'm like, yeah, you need to watch it. I was blown away. I was completely blown away. I learned a lot from it and did a lot of digging in certain aspects, but especially about ALEC and how far-reaching that organization is. It's insane. If you dive into ALEC, I promise you, you're going to be blown away.
And you know
I
what? They're
was.
not the only ones on the block.
No, they're not.
They're not the only lobbying firm that operates in that way, right?
That's right.
That their entire being is just to lobby and to pass laws that help them, you know, and their corporations earn more money. It's just that they're the biggest one, I think.
Well, they certainly were. I don't know about now. I haven't really looked at it since I dove off into ALEC a few years ago. It's crazy, man. Yeah, and there are other ones that are pretty big as well.
Well, any last final thoughts on this one, Jack?
Oh, I definitely recommend, if you haven't watched it, if you're interested in our criminal justice system and our society as a whole, you definitely need to watch it. Take it in, think about it. And hey, you know what? Take it a step further. If you get pissed off enough like I did, write your senator and congressman and say, what's going on? Have you thought about these aspects of our criminal justice system and how it impacts society as a whole? Yeah, be polite, be professional, but
Well, that's such a good tip. You're gonna get what do they say? You're gonna attract more bees with honey than you will with vinegar.
Yep, that's right.
That's right. Well, I guess that's it for us today. This has been Documentary Club, a place for documentary lovers. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jack.
And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.